I was alone at home that day because my husband was away on a trip. The house was quiet, and I found myself feeling lonely despite the calm. I spent the morning tidying up and reading, lost in my own thoughts about life and the small emptiness that sometimes crept in. I had been feeling a need for a bit of company and a change from my usual routine. That is why I made the decision to invite my boss over. I thought it might be nice to have a friendly conversation and to share some ideas about work in a relaxed setting. When he arrived, I greeted him warmly, hoping that our discussion would be both professional and pleasant. At first, we talked about everyday work matters and shared a few laughs. I felt at ease, believing that this was just a simple meeting between colleagues. However, as the afternoon went on, I noticed his behavior slowly shifting. His once polite manner grew more forward. He began to lean in too close, and his hand rested on my arm longer than was appropriate. I felt a flutter of discomfort, but I tried to brush it off, thinking that perhaps I was just being overly cautious. Before I knew it, his actions became bolder. He touched me in ways that I did not welcome, and his words took on a tone that made me feel both shocked and confused. I tried to step back and speak up, but my voice caught in my throat. In that moment, I realized that the friendly meeting had turned into something I had not agreed to. I felt trapped and helpless as he crossed every boundary I had set, and the simple conversation I had expected turned into an experience filled with fear and regret. I sat there frozen, as his actions overwhelmed me. I remembered that my husband was not home, and I thought I was safe in my own space, yet I felt exposed and violated. My heart pounded, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. I did not know what to do next. I wished I had never made the decision to invite him, and I felt a deep sense of betrayal, not just by his actions, but by my own choice. I felt lost in a mix of loneliness and shock, wondering how a moment of seeking company could turn into something so painful. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to find the strength to tell him to stop. I left the room as quietly as I could, retreating to my bedroom where I sat on the bed and let my tears flow. I felt alone and scared, burdened by the weight of what had just happened. In that quiet room, I began to understand that I had been hurt in a way that I could not easily forget. Now, I am left with a heavy heart and many questions. I know I must find a way to heal and learn to protect myself. The memory of that day is a constant reminder that sometimes the choices we make can lead to pain, and that it is important to listen to our inner voice when something does not feel right. I hope that by sharing my story, I can begin the process of recovery and find the strength to rebuild the trust I once had in my own judgment. Today, I decided to invite my boss over to my home. My husband was away and I was feeling lonely. I thought that having a friendly conversation might lift my spirits and give me a break from my usual routine. I believed that discussing work and sharing ideas in a relaxed setting would be a nice change. When he arrived, he greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake. His confident manner made me feel a little special, and I welcomed the company. We sat together and began to talk about work, our plans for upcoming projects, and even shared a few lighthearted jokes. For a while, everything seemed normal, and I felt comfortable with his presence. However, as our conversation continued, I started to notice subtle changes in his behavior. At first, it was just small gestures. He leaned in a little too close, and his eyes lingered on me longer than necessary. I tried to dismiss these signs, thinking they were simply friendly habits. But soon, those small actions grew bolder. He began to place his hand on my arm during our discussion, and his touch felt more deliberate and invasive. My heart began to race, and a feeling of discomfort settled over me. I tried to maintain my composure and keep the conversation going, hoping that maybe I was misreading the situation. I reminded myself that he was still my boss, and I did not want to create any awkwardness. However, his behavior continued to cross the boundaries, linger a little too long. I felt a small flicker of discomfort, but tried to ignore it, thinking he might simply be friendly. However, the small gestures soon grew bolder. His compliments became more personal, and his touch moved from my arm to my shoulder without my asking. Each time he came closer, I felt a mix of confusion and unease. I had invited him for a simple conversation, not expecting anything to cross the boundaries I had always maintained. My heart began to race, and I could feel the tension building inside me. Before I knew it, his actions became too much to ignore. The friendly tone of our discussion shifted, and his behavior turned invasive. I tried to speak up, but my voice felt stuck, and I struggled to form the words. I sat there, trapped by my own indecision and the sudden realization that I was in a situation I had never planned for. Every touch, every lingering look made me feel violated in my own home, a place that should have been safe. I wished I could go back in time and undo the decision to invite him over. I felt betrayed, not only by his actions but by my own choice that led me to this painful moment. The comfortable space I had created turned cold and unwelcoming as fear and regret took over. I felt isolated, as if I were completely alone with my doubts and fears. At last, I found the strength to say what needed to be said. With a trembling voice, I told him that his behavior was not acceptable and that I needed him to leave immediately. As he gathered his things, the weight of the moment pressed on me, and I could only watch, overwhelmed by sadness and a deep sense of loss. After he left, silence filled my home. I sat alone, trying to make sense of what had happened and questioning my judgment. I realized that trusting my instincts is essential, and I learned that even in moments of loneliness, it is important to protect my own boundaries. The memory of that day remains with me, a constant reminder of the importance of listening to my inner voice and standing up for myself. I sat quietly, trying to focus on our conversation, when suddenly everything shifted. My boss leaned in closer than before, and his touch went further than I had ever expected. His hand rested on my shoulder in a way that felt forceful and invasive. In that split second, I felt a jolt of shock run through me. My heart pounded loudly and my hands began to tremble. Every small gesture now seemed like a clear violation of my personal space. I realized with a sinking feeling that he was crossing a line I had never agreed to cross. The room grew smaller as fear and disbelief filled my mind. I could feel my breath quicken, and my thoughts raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. This was not just a friendly visit. This was an abuse of power, a moment I would never have imagined. I sat there, frozen, caught between the urge to scream and the overwhelming shock that kept me silent. The silence was heavy, and every second felt like an eternity. Slowly, a surge of determination began to build inside me. Despite the fear that had wrapped around me like a tight knot, I realized that I deserved to be safe. I remembered that my home was my sanctuary and I had every right to protect it. I clutched my hands together, trying to gather the courage that was buried beneath layers of shock and confusion. My pulse raced, and my mind became clear with a single thought. I had to stop this. With a trembling voice, I finally managed to say, "Stop." The word was small, yet it carried the weight of every suppressed feeling and every right I had to my own dignity. My voice echoed in the charged air, and for a moment, everything paused. He hesitated, his face revealing a flicker of uncertainty. That brief pause was all the strength I needed. I repeated my demand, louder this time, and made it clear that his actions were unacceptable. In that critical moment, I felt a shift. The fear that had once controlled me began to recede, replaced by a newfound determination. I stood up, my body trembling, but my voice growing firmer. I told him clearly that he was not allowed to treat me that way, and that he must leave immediately. Every word I spoke was laced with both sorrow for the betrayal and a fierce resolve to reclaim my power. I felt the heavy weight of his abuse of trust, but I also felt my own strength emerging as I refused to be a victim. As he stepped back, his confident demeanor crumbled, and I saw uncertainty in his eyes. The room was thick with tension, yet in that heaviness, I discovered a spark of self-respect I had long forgotten. I realized that this painful experience would leave scars, but it would also remind me of my worth. I had taken the first step to protect myself, and even though fear still lingered, I knew I would not allow anyone to disrespect me again. That moment, filled with pain and defiance, marked the turning point where I chose to stand up for myself, no matter the cost. I sat alone in my living. I had set for myself. His hand would rest on my shoulder when I wasn't expecting it, and his comments started to carry a tone that made me feel uneasy. Each small gesture added to a growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. I felt confused and scared as I realized that the friendly invitation had turned into an experience I had not agreed to. I wanted to speak up, to tell him that his actions were unacceptable, but my voice felt trapped inside me. I sat there, feeling more isolated than ever, and wondered how I had let things go so far. In that moment, I realized that I had made a mistake by inviting him into my home. The room that once felt warm and welcoming now seemed to close in around me. I felt exposed and vulnerable, as if every inch of my personal space had been invaded. My mind raced with thoughts of regret and fear. I wished I could rewind time and undo the decision that led me here. The comfortable environment I had tried to create quickly turned into a place of pain and betrayal. After what felt like an eternity, I found the courage to pull away. I managed to tell him, in a trembling voice, that his behavior was not acceptable. I needed space, and I needed to regain control over my own home. I spent the rest of the day in silence, struggling to process the hurt and confusion that had taken root inside me. I knew that this experience would leave a lasting mark, and I had to find a way to heal from it. I invited my boss over for a chat since I was feeling a bit lonely while my husband was away. At first, I thought it would be just a friendly conversation about work and life. When he arrived, his smile and confident manner made me feel at ease. We started talking about upcoming projects and shared a few laughs. However, as time went on, I began to notice small actions that made me uncomfortable. At the start, it was little things. He leaned in a bit too close when he laughed, and his hand rested on my arm for a moment longer than I expected. I tried to brush it off, thinking he was just being friendly, but soon his touches grew bolder. He complimented me on my appearance in ways that felt too personal, and his eyes seemed to linger on me with an intensity that made my heart race. I felt a rising discomfort that I could not ignore. With every passing minute, I sensed that his behavior was crossing boundaries. His hand, which had earlier only grazed my arm, now moved in ways that made me feel exposed and uneasy. I found myself wishing the conversation would return to safer topics. I tried to focus on our discussion about work, but the way he kept moving closer and touching me made it hard to think clearly. I felt a mix of confusion, anger, and fear building inside me. I started to question the decision I had made. I had invited him simply to talk, yet now I felt trapped in a situation that was quickly spiraling out of control. Each subtle gesture, once seemingly harmless, now piled up, leaving me overwhelmed. I wanted to speak up to tell him to stop, but my voice felt stuck. I was caught between not wanting to hurt his feelings and the growing realization that he was ignoring my personal space. Inside, I was filled with uncertainty. I kept asking myself if I was overreacting, or if his actions were really wrong. But as his small moves became more frequent and more invasive, the feeling of dread became impossible to ignore. The warm, welcoming atmosphere I had hoped to create was now replaced by a tense, heavy air that made every second feel longer than the last. I felt a deep sadness and betrayal. The person I had trusted was now making me feel unsafe in my own home. I couldn't shake the feeling that every touch, every lingering look was a violation of my boundaries. My mind raced with thoughts of regret for inviting him over and regret for not standing up sooner. In that moment, I realized how important it was to trust my instincts and protect my own space. All these small gestures added up, creating a heavy sense of isolation and fear. I sat there, overwhelmed by the realization that what began as a simple meeting had turned into an experience that left me feeling hurt and exposed. The tension was unbearable, and I knew that I needed to find a way to reclaim control over my own life and safety. I invited my boss to my home one quiet afternoon when my husband was away on a trip. I was feeling lonely and thought that having a friendly chat might brighten my day. I welcomed him warmly, and we sat together in my living room, talking about work and everyday life. At first, everything seemed normal. His confident smile and casual conversation made me feel at ease, and I believed I had made a good decision. As our conversation continued, I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. He started leaning in a bit closer than before, and his eyes held a look that I hadn't seen during our usual office interactions. His hand, which at first rested lightly on my arm, began to room after he left, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The silence that followed was overwhelming, a heavy, unyielding quiet that pressed in from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands trembled uncontrollably as I tried to process the shock of his actions. I kept replaying every moment in my mind, feeling a deep sense of hurt and betrayal. A sudden sound from outside, like the rumble of a passing car, broke that oppressive silence. For a brief moment, I felt distracted, but it only served as a reminder that the world outside was still turning, indifferent to the pain I was enduring. I knew I couldn't let this silence become permanent. I had to face my feelings, however painful they might be. In the quiet aftermath, I felt anger slowly bubbling up inside me, anger at him for crossing every boundary, and anger at myself for inviting him over in the first place. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone in a space that was supposed to be my sanctuary. The hurt was sharp, a constant reminder of that terrible breach of trust, and I couldn't shake off the regret that weighed down on me. I wondered how a simple invitation could lead to something so damaging, questioning every decision that had led me to this moment. Tears streamed down my face as I sat there, overwhelmed by the mix of emotions. I felt betrayed by someone I had trusted, and a deep sadness settled in my heart. In that heavy silence, I allowed the tears to come, each drop marking the loss of a part of the trust and safety I once felt. I remembered the warmth of my home and how it used to feel like a haven, and now that feeling had been tainted by what had happened. Slowly, I began to realize that this experience would change me. The pain was real, and the marks it left would be hard to erase, but I also knew that I had to find a way to reclaim my strength. I thought about reaching out for help, about talking to someone who could understand and support me through this difficult time. The idea of sharing my story scared me, yet the thought of keeping it all inside was even more unbearable. I resolved to stand up for myself. I understood that I deserved to feel safe and respected in my own home. The hurt and the anger, while overwhelming, also ignited a determination in me. I promised myself that I would seek the help I needed, and I would work on healing from this painful experience. I decided that I would not let this moment define my future. The quiet slowly began to ease as I took a few deep breaths, each one a small step towards regaining control. I reminded myself that while the day had been filled with regret and sorrow, it also marked the beginning of a new resolve, a promise to myself that I would protect my boundaries and never allow such a violation to happen again. Though the pain was still fresh, I knew that in time, I would find the strength to heal and move forward, reclaiming my sense of safety and self-worth. I sit here alone thinking about everything that happened. I feel a heavy mix of guilt, fear, and confusion. I keep asking myself how I let things get so out of control. I invited him over, and now I am left with a deep sense of regret. Every thought of that day makes my heart ache. I wonder if I did something wrong, or if it was just his behavior that crossed the line. I remember that moment clearly. His touch, which started so gently, soon became too bold. I felt his hand on my shoulder, lingering far longer than I ever wanted. In that instant, I felt lost and betrayed. I wished I had spoken up sooner, but fear kept me silent. Now, as I face the consequences, I am overwhelmed by the reality of what has happened. I feel guilt for letting him into my home, a place where I believed I would always be safe. I keep replaying the day in my mind, thinking about every detail. I feel afraid of the future and scared that I may not be able to trust anyone again. The trust I had in myself is shaken, and I wonder if I will ever feel secure in my own space. I feel a deep sadness for the lost innocence and the damage done to the comfort I once had. Anger bubbles up inside me too. I am angry at him for his behavior, and I am angry at myself for not protecting my boundaries. I question my decisions and feel confused about where I went wrong. I remind myself that I am not to blame for his actions, yet I cannot help feeling responsible for inviting him in. This internal struggle leaves me exhausted and full of doubts. In these quiet moments, I begin to understand that I must learn from this pain. I know I need to stand up for myself and set clear limits in the future. I promise myself that I will not allow anyone to take advantage of my kindness again. I need to find the strength to forgive myself and rebuild the trust I once had in my own judgment. The experience has changed how I see myself and my worth, and I must work hard to reclaim my confidence. I realize that healing will take time and that I cannot rush this process. I think about reaching out to someone, a friend or a counselor, who can help me sort through these feelings. Sharing my story might be difficult, but I know that holding everything inside will only make the pain heavier. I remind myself that I deserve to feel safe and respected, no matter what has happened. Even though I am hurting now, I believe that this moment can be a turning point in my life. I choose to learn from my mistakes and promise myself that I will protect my boundaries in the future. I will remember that my home is my safe space and that I have every right to defend it. Today, I make a vow to work on healing, to regain my self-worth, and to move forward with a stronger sense of who I am. I know it won't be easy, but I believe that with time I can find peace again. I feel the weight of my decision pressing on me. I know that what happened was not my fault, yet I cannot ignore the pain that lingers. I am faced with a difficult choice. I could confront him and demand that he acknowledge the harm he caused, or I could tell someone who might help me, or I might try to move on quietly without giving him any more power over my life. I think about confronting him. Part of me wants to stand up and say, "This is not right, and I will not tolerate it." But the thought of facing him again fills me with fear. I worry that his presence, his power, might overwhelm me and I might not be able to speak the truth. I am afraid that my words will come out weak and that he will use his influence to dismiss my feelings. I want to be strong, but my heart is still fragile from the hurt. Then I consider telling someone about what happened. Maybe I could confide in a trusted friend or a colleague who might understand and support me. I imagine that sharing my story could help me heal, and it might even prevent him from hurting someone else in the future. But I am scared of the consequences. I worry that speaking out will affect my work, that it might change how people see me or even lead to further problems. I am not sure if I am ready to face the fallout that might come from exposing his behavior. The third choice is to try and move on quietly. I could bury the memory deep inside, pretending nothing happened so that I can continue with my life as if I am okay. I know deep down that ignoring the pain will only let it fester and grow. Moving on silently might seem easier in the short term, but it would not bring me the healing or the closure I need. I deserve to feel safe and respected, and hiding my pain does not help me regain that feeling. I sit with these thoughts, feeling torn and unsure. Every option comes with its own risks and uncertainties. I feel a deep loss of trust, not only in him but in the idea that people will treat me with the respect I deserve. Yet I also know that I must reclaim my dignity and find a way to heal from this experience. I remind myself that my home is my sanctuary and that I have the right to protect it. I know that there is no perfect solution. Each path is filled with challenges and difficult moments. What matters most is that I choose a path that helps me stand up for myself and begin to heal. I want to learn from this pain, to grow stronger and more confident, even if the future is uncertain. Today, I promise myself that I will seek help and support, and that I will not allow this moment to define who I am. I am still unsure which choice to make, and the uncertainty is a heavy burden. But I also see a small spark of hope, a promise that, with time, I can find the strength to rebuild my life and regain my self-worth. I know that whatever decision I make now will be a step toward healing, even if it is a slow and difficult process.